Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Curious Around podcast. I'm so excited to have Amy here today. And I always love it when somebody comes back. It's like, it means that everybody had lots of questions around your topic, but also that you wanted to come back and have a chat. So I appreciate that. Thanks for coming back, Amy.
Thank you for having me back. I had a blast last time I was here,
We
so I was
did.
excited to come back.
The topic that you were covering is so needed. I think coming out of the pandemic as well, I was hearing a lot of people talk about the relationship and the hardships that they were experiencing. So I think it'll be good for us to kind of tackle a few of the topics from your book, your new book. Congratulations, by the way. Is it out yet?
It is. Came out
It is
the
out
day
now.
after Christmas.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
It's a perfect gift for your partner. There's a few topics we're going to talk about, but one of them in particular, my husband and I started talking about it and we started butting heads about it. So it's going to be great for us to kind of break that down because I think that the way we were approaching it might be, a way that people kind of relate to. So we can talk about that in a second.
Oh, that sounds good.
The first one I wanted to talk about was for me, what stood out is for you said in your first chapter, 47% of people don't bring up problems with their partners. I guess that's kind of a segue into this conversation, but because they fear that it'll make things worse. And I've been part of that too, especially when there's kids in the conversation and you have like a minute and a half to have like a really difficult discussion sometimes. And, we don't have a lot of that time. You don't want to stir things. And if things are going well, it's hard to bring it up. So is this the reason why you mentioned this in your book?
Yeah, that's a big reason. So people will often say, like, when things are going well, I don't want to rock the boat.
No.
So I don't want to bring up this, whether it's a financial issue or we disagree
Yeah.
on parenting. But then when things are rough, people are like, oh, I don't think we can quite take it right now. If I bring up this thing, like it could lead to an explosion and things might fall apart. So, and it makes sense that we don't want to bring up problems. Like sometimes you just think, well, I can get through today without bringing it up. And I can get through tomorrow without bringing it up. And then that goes on day after day. And sometimes people would come into my therapy office and they'd say, well, I was waiting for a good time. Well, often there's never like the good time to say, hey, by the way, I'm really struggling with this or I'm having a hard time. Like it's never going to feel like, oh, this is the perfect time to bring up that problem. But we've all done that. I know that we have where we're like, today's not a good day. Well, tomorrow might not be either. But then the consequence is the longer that a problem is left unaddressed, the more likely it is to grow bigger. And it puts us at a greater risk for developing resentment or for growing apart. Sometimes we go our separate ways and try to solve the problem from two different angles. And then we aren't working together as a team like we should be.
Right. And, especially with kids, it's so easy to push it to the side, right? We're so busy. And then nighttime comes and you might be chilling out with your partner and just like relaxing. And sometimes also just one partner brings it up, right? So if you're the one partner that keeps bringing things up, it's like you're trying to stir things up and you're trying to cause an argument, right? It might feel that way. And I'm assuming that's a reason for not wanting to bring it up as well.
Yeah, it is. And sometimes people are like, well, my partner doesn't want to hear it. Or when I bring it up, they minimize my feelings or they dismiss me altogether. So yeah, no wonder you wouldn't want to bring anything up. If you feel like you can't problem solve and move forward, then why would you bother to bring it up if you think it's just going to end in a fight?
Right. Yeah, I get that. So, I guess there's certain problems, I guess different like levels of intensity, but is it possible that sometimes a couple just feels like, what's the point of bringing it up? It can't be solved. Like if you're arguing about, I don't know, a family member, that's trying to get in the way of certain things or finances, like that you bring it up, it might not change it tomorrow. Is that usually a reason that you see that people just feel like, what's the point? It won't be solved anyways.
There are. And I think there's validity to that and to recognize that not all problems can be solved. And so if you and your partner have different, say, religions, arguing about it is not going to solve the problem. You might just need to accept, okay, I believe this, you believe that. And instead, you might talk about how we're going to raise our kids or what are we going to do. Or if you take your health super serious and your partner doesn't, you don't want to get into trying to fix them, trying to change them, which I also talk about later in the book, but just recognizing and asking yourself that question, like, is this a problem I need to solve or a problem that I need to address by addressing how I feel about the problem? Because sometimes it's that. You might want your partner to stop, I don't know, doing something with their extended family. Like, hey, you shouldn't get on the phone and argue with your mom every night. Well, it's might not be your place to say. So it might just be, I'm going to manage my own emotions. If my partner chooses to do that, then it's not my problem to fix. Instead, it's just my choice of how am I going to deal with this problem.
That's really hard, right? Like to say,
It
because
is.
I guess we always expect the problem to be solved. And if it isn't, then like you mentioned before, the resentment or the space, like we build a distance between ourselves, between each other. So let's just use that example. Let's say a partner who's like often on the phone with a family member, or they're arguing, or they have a habit that you don't agree with. If how do we work through that, right? Is it a certain kind of conversation that we're having with them, or is it just about like you doing the work on the side and saying, well, this won't change and I have to become okay with that?
So I think anything like that, you want to accept your role in it. So let's say you have a partner who maybe has a sibling that always has the crisis of the week. So you have a
Yes.
husband who gets on the phone with his sister constantly because there's always a crisis. And maybe that interrupts. You're like, "Hey, we're eating dinner," and you have to go answer the phone from your sister or
Right.
something along those lines. You then might say, all right, I'm going to talk about how this affects us, but I'm only going to do it once. It's really then up to your partner to then decide. If your partner says, no, my sister needs me, so I'm going to answer the phone, even if we're eating dinner. If you've said, hey, I'm struggling with this, and your partner
Mm.
says, and I'm not going to change my behavior, then your job is to say, well, what am I going to do differently about this?
Mm.
Instead of yelling and carrying on, maybe you just ignore it. Maybe you don't ask, how's your sister doing? Because you don't want to get caught up in a 3-hour conversation
Right.
about it. But you can say, how do I change my behavior? And if you've brought it up and it's not being addressed, then again, you say, well, what action can I take? How do I address my behavior?
Mm.
Sometimes we get into these patterns where we're frustrated with the other person's behavior. So then we're like slamming stuff around,
Mm.
expecting them to notice or that they'll
Right.
change. Or we, kind of do these subtle things thinking that, I just won't talk to you for a little bit and see if you notice. Or I'm going to go to my room, almost like we're
They don't
punishing them.
notice. Right.
Right.
They
And
don't.
then we get more frustrated. So
Right.
I think it's really then about saying, all right, like what's within my control
Mm.
and how do I be supportive to my partner if these are the choices that they're making, and how do I manage that? And that is tough to do, especially if we're talking about kids. If it affects the whole
Mm.
family, if they're doing something that affects your kids and you're like, how do I explain this to the kids why my partner does this? So it's not easy, but at the same
Mm.
time, to know that you can address it, bring it up, just don't lecture them and don't whatever, bring up how you feel
Mm.
about it, and then focus on changing your behavior. And that's still addressing a problem, even if your partner isn't on board with changing their behavior.
Right. And is there room for setting a boundary? Like, are you able to, or should you, or could you accept the behavior, but say, let's just use the example of the sister calling, right? I, I accept that you need to speak with her every day, that you need to help her and all of that. But I don't want it to happen at dinner time, or I don't want it to impact our family dinner. Can we kind of work with them to create a boundary?
Absolutely. If they're open to that, where you say, like, is there a way you could take that call on your commute home? Is there
Right.
a way
Yeah.
that, or for 1 hour during the evening from 6 to 7, is it possible to leave your phone in the other room? Here's maybe the habits that we're teaching our kids that it's okay to
Right.
do that, and to have those sorts of conversations,
Mm.
and yeah, absolutely set a boundary if you can.
Boundaries are so hard to, I just want to touch on that a little bit, because I know that as for myself, I only started learning how to set boundaries later in my 30s. I had never really taken the time to work on that. And the more I speak to my friends about this, they are also in the same boat where they never really wanted to set certain boundaries with friends, with partners. They just felt bad that it might cause the other person to get upset and so on. But do you see this as well in relationships where people struggle to set a boundary with their partner, even if it's like somebody we should be opened with?
Absolutely. And in fact, since this book has come out, I've had so many people say, it never even occurred to me that it's okay to set a boundary with your partner, because they
Wow.
thought,
That,
if we
yeah.
live in the same house and we're together, then, you don't have to knock on the door. It's okay for you to check my email or look over my
Mm.
shoulder if my laptop's open. And it just really never occurred to a lot of people, like, well, there are
Mm.
still some rules when it comes to privacy that you can
Mm-hmm.
have. And it's okay to talk to your partner about things you're uncomfortable with, and to
Mm.
let them know, like, hey, this is what I'm planning to do, and this is what I
Mm.
would hope that you would respect. So yeah, and I think a lot of
Mm.
people aren't used to setting boundaries. They haven't done it. Feels awkward and uncomfortable, even with your partner, especially if you've been together for 10 years and suddenly you're like, actually, I'd like you to knock on the door when you come in. People are like, well,
It's
that
like,
feels
what?
really weird,
Right.
right? But it's okay to do that.
Yeah. It takes practice too. For myself, I had to learn how to set a boundary with my mom. I'm okay saying that. Everybody knows. I talk about it often on the podcast, but it was hard because it's hard for her to hear the boundary. And it's like, but I'm your mom. How can you have a boundary around me? And it's like,
Right.
yes, but because I'm overwhelmed with 3 kids right now, and I don't have the capacity to help you with your own issues right now, like we'll get back to it when they're older. But just I think the compassion piece with the boundary really helped me to kind of set that boundary with her, and also to practice when I wasn't on the phone with her, knowing that she would respond to it a certain way. It's kind of like I rehearsed it, and it really helped me to set that boundary with her. So you can set the boundary with anybody.
You can. And like you
Yeah.
say, you'd think that it would be easier with the people we're closest to, but
Oh,
sometimes
it's the
it's
hardest.
the toughest
Yeah.
with the people because
Yeah.
you think, oh, I don't want to disappoint them. I don't want to offend
Mhm.
them. And if they're used to you always acting in a certain way when you set a boundary, they're like, push back against it because they're like,
Right.
wait, you don't usually do this.
Yeah. And it's so easy to just give in and say like,
Right.
okay, yeah. I want to just bring up first a quick second, because we're talking about behaviors as well that we might not agree with our partner, but there is a line, right? Like if there's something that's happening that's disrespectful, and you bring this up at the beginning of your book, at, talking about like, who's this book for and who's it not for? Can we just make sure that we address that? Because maybe there's somebody who's listening saying, well, what if they're disrespecting me in front of the kids? That's not where you would say like, let's accept that behavior in this home.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up
Mm,
because I did want people to know that my book can help as long as
mm,
your relationship is at a certain level of health.
right.
If you're in an abusive relationship, I don't want you to think that reading this book is going
Right.
to change everything, or that if you're struggling in a relationship that's abusive, that means that you're not strong enough. And if you
Right.
just hold on a little bit longer, that something's going to change.
Mm,
There are absolute limits where sometimes you have to say, all right, perhaps the traditional
mm,
advice that helps most relationships isn't going to help mine. And whether you need some professional support in terms of a
mhm.
therapist, or you need some peer support or guidance from a lawyer to help you figure out next
Right.
steps. I just wanted to make it crystal clear that these strategies will not work and are not appropriate for people who are perhaps being physically or emotionally
Right.
abused or just in a really toxic situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just thought it was important to address that at the beginning, because with what we're talking about, somebody who's in that situation might think, so do I need to change my behavior? But it's not about that. This is a very different conversation. So, I love that you have these little, I'm looking to the right because I have my notes and some screenshots, but like, I love that you have these sort of quizzes and these questions, so that we're not just reading through the information in your book, but you're also helping guide us in terms of, is this happening in my relationship? And now what? Like, what do I do with this? Um, you know, so part of the quiz that you have at the end of that chapter, and I just want to bring up a few so that people know where to begin, but you talk about like, read over the following statements and think about how many of them describe your relationship. So we rarely discuss big issues in our relationship. We argue over small things, but don't discuss the underlying problem. There's a lot more, but I just wanted to highlight those two, because maybe some people will be able to identify themselves in their relationship just with those 2 points, especially the fact that like, you argue over small things. How is that part of, because somebody might see that as, well, we argue, we're clearly bringing up the problem, but you mentioned the underlying thing. Can you share that a little bit more about that with us?
Yeah, more often than not, when people would come into therapy and talk about their conflict, the thing they were arguing about was usually a symptom of an underlying problem. So they might be arguing about, say, money, how much money's in the bank account versus how much somebody spent on something. Well, the real problem isn't just how much money's in the bank account. The real problem might be their values about money.
Mm-hmm.
One person might say, I need a
Right.
fairly uh, big amount of money in the bank to feel safe on a
Right.
regular
Yeah.
basis. The other person might be like, nobody, there's no prize at the end of your life for how much money you had in the bank. Let's enjoy it.
It's true.
And so when you have those two different viewpoints, yeah, you're probably going to argue about money. And until you can really get to the root of that, your arguments over how much you spent on lunch aren't really going to get you anywhere.
Hmm. It's true. And it's hard to get to the bottom of it sometimes, right? But I guess you also guide us in your book in terms of talking about like the values, like you said, or like your priorities, right? Like maybe that's where the conversation needs to be. And maybe that's a good place to start as a couple.
Yeah, because a lot of people we make assumptions about our partner. Like, oh, the
We
reason
do.
that they always come home and throw themselves on the couch is because they're lazy.
Right.
Maybe they're just exhausted from a long day and their idea of unwinding is just taking 30 minutes on the couch to rest, and they have no plans to change that. Yet
Hmm.
we find ourselves thinking like, oh, how could you be like that? But if we have more conversations like, oh, what's important to you about
Hmm.
life? Like how important
Mm-hmm.
are friends and family, and where do they fall, and money and education, and recreation and just having more conversations to really figure out like why do somebody's priorities look the way that they do
Mm.
versus ours, and so that they aren't going to always line up. And it would be boring if they did. If somebody had the exact same priorities you do, we probably wouldn't
Right.
need them in your life. It would be
Yeah.
really quite boring. But that's the whole point, is sometimes
Mm.
maybe cleaning the house is a higher priority for one person than the other, as it almost always is, or spending time with friends is. But we often think like, oh, they're not doing enough to help me because they don't care, or they spend so much time with their friends because they don't like to be home and they don't care about me. And it's those sorts of assumptions that we make that often
Mm.
can be quite damaging to the relationship.
We often feel that our partner knows what we're thinking. I don't know if I'm the only one. So I had placed when we, after we got married and we got our first home, I would place items, let's say like if I bought some toothpaste or toilet paper on the stairs to go upstairs, thinking that there was a universal like language of anything that's on the stairs has to go upstairs to be placed. And he would never, he would never touch it. He'd walk right by it. And I think months and months passed and I was building the anger inside without saying anything because I just thought like it's known. You're just avoiding it intentionally until I mentioned it to him and he's like, oh, I didn't know. Thanks for
Right.
telling me. But it's an example of, how quickly some little thought or idea that you had, or you thought that they knew what you were thinking could lead to anger inside where you're not addressing it. And, them not doing something leads to a lot of anger inside. And that's why we have to bring it up, like you said.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great example of one little thing. But when you
Right.
don't discuss it, we make assumptions.
I
And
know.
sometimes we're like, it's obvious. I shouldn't have to say it. But it's not obvious to the other person. And so
Hmm.
when you can spell it out and say, oh, here's what I was
Literally.
thinking, right? What are you
Yeah.
thinking? And what was behind this? Makes things so much clearer.
Yeah, I get it. Part of this is another chapter that I really enjoyed is, mentally strong couples don't expect the relationship to meet all their needs. And my husband and I had a really good conversation around this. And I think we were stuck in that, or I was stuck in that at some point where I just felt that it should, and that's the way that it should be. But what were you seeing, I guess, in your practice that led to you using this as one of your 13 things that mentally strong couples do?
So a lot of people would come into my office and like they thought that their marriage or that their long-term relationship was going to cure their depression, that it would fix
Mm,
their anxiety, that
got it.
suddenly once they were in a committed relationship that they wouldn't have a need for friends or family anymore, cuz like
Mm,
person is going to be my everything. And right down to like, I don't need to do that anymore cuz we're a team, we're together.
mm,
And they would almost abandon so many things in their life. And then they would be disappointed that the
I
relationship
get that.
didn't meet all of their needs, that they
Mm,
thought, didn't make my depression go away. Or
mm,
sometimes on the other end, people thought like they were kind of saving their partner. Like if we get together, my partner won't really struggle anymore. They won't
mm,
worry about things so much, or they'll finally be happy. Or
mm,
that childhood trauma, they'll know they're safe with me. So once we get
mm.
together, they won't really have to worry about those things anymore. It doesn't work like that. And
Yeah.
so we should have friends outside of our relationship. Your friends can be your companions for fun stuff that you like to do that your partner doesn't. Your family might be your confidant for certain things. If you have somebody who can relate to the business that you're in, you have those conversations with them as opposed to your partner. There's so many different people that can play different roles in our lives if we're open to making sure that we do that. Otherwise,
Mm,
we depend on our partners so much. Like, I want you to be kind of my business partner because we're going to run all the finances together. And
right.
also, we are going to be a team who cleans the house and manages all the responsibilities, and the kids. We're going to parent it together. And then when I want to do fun stuff, I'm going to depend on you to be the only person who will do it. And by the way, I'm going to tell you all the secrets about everything that I, want to talk
Right.
about. And then you kind of have to be my therapist too, because when I'm struggling, and you think, holy cow, we're
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
depending on somebody way too much.
Yeah. Oh, the the picture you just painted now is perfect because you realize how much of a, not, can I say burden? Like it's a lot for one person to take in, or to have that responsibility. I mean, to do all that. I just interviewed this week. It was a researcher who was studying men and mental health, and he was saying how some men feel that once they are in a relationship, that they don't end up with friends on the outside. They often come and put everything into their partner and their kids eventually, but they don't have any outside connections. So it just makes me think of what you just said, like the importance of that and how heavy it is on the person who feels like I'm everything for that one person. Like if I'm not their friend and their best friend and their business partner and their life partner, all of that at the same time, that I'm failing, right? I'm assuming that
Yeah.
that feels very heavy.
Yeah, it does. And then people are like, what else am I supposed to do? Or when one
Mm,
partner is struggling with something, they have a parent going through a health issue and they're like, I can't be all of these things right now. We
right,
have different seasons in our lives where we're able to give more and times when we can't give as much. You don't want to build yourself into that situation where you're the only person that your partner can rely on. You want to make
right,
sure that they have other people in their life too.
right. So how, as a couple, can we develop that awareness? So if somebody's listening to this and saying, I'm actually not sure if we do that, like what sort of questions should they be asking themselves?
So I think to have those sorts of conversations about like what needs do I meet in your life? It's always great to hear somebody say, you know, when I am having a bad day and I can reach out to you and you get right back to me, like that's huge.
That
That's a
feels good.
great,
Yeah.
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 And to make sure that we're complimenting each other on this is what you do for me and this is what you do really, really well. And I super appreciate it. And then you could have some other conversations like where might our needs not match up? And in the book, I go
Mm,
into more details about what our needs might be. But somebody might say, you know, I have a need for a little more independence and alone time. Your partner might have more need for companionship and they like to
mm-hmm,
always be around people. So then what can we do? Well, it might just be that the person who has more of a need for recreational companionship might have a friend who, hey, I like to go hiking
mm-hmm.
too. So, okay, great. Then you go hiking with your friend and I'm going to take some alone time while you're gone. So I think just asking those sorts of
Yeah.
questions, like what do
Mm.
we do well to meet each other's needs and how do we get those needs met in an appropriate way outside of the relationship too?
And not to avoid that conversation, like we just said before,
Right.
right? Like, because it might be
Right.
hard for you to open up about like what you're not, you know, which needs you're not really addressing of mine. And maybe some partners want to say, like, no, you're perfect. Everything is fine. Right. I'm assuming that would be more comfortable than saying, well,
Right. I
yeah,
think it is
yeah.
tough. Just have some candid conversations.
Hmm.
Like if, you know, you're maybe it's like gossipy kind of stuff that you're like, yeah, my partner doesn't need to hear about this, but I know somebody that would enjoy it.
Yeah.
Or you like a certain sport or something, and you're like, you know, it's just not my partner's thing. They're not into fishing or golfing or whatever else. Or I love to go for walks in nature. It's not my partner's thing.
Hmm.
That's okay. You don't want to mold them into something that they're not,
No.
or try to convince them to hang out with
Hmm.
you if they're really not going to enjoy it. Then you say, yeah, you know what, or there's this thing that I used to love. I used to love to go to art museums, or I
Mm-hmm.
used to love to have this hobby that I did. And I know you're not really into it, but how can I still incorporate that into my life without
Mm-hmm.
abandoning the family? But on the other hand, this is important to me. So how do I make time for it and still
Hmm.
make sure that I'm getting my needs met?
Right. You mentioned the outside connections, and I had a really interesting conversation with a friend over the summer who had been married for a bit less than a year, and she felt that like her partner didn't want her to ever talk about like any private issues, any arguments that they had with her best friends. And she was struggling because it had been a year where they were having certain arguments, and she had finally opened up to me. And I said, that's okay. I've had that argument as well. It's very normal. And she felt this weight. She just started crying. And it wasn't even a very serious problem, but she just felt that she was the only one. You know, she had a brand new marriage and she shouldn't be having any arguments with her partner because it was a new marriage. And I tried to reassure her. And you know, she didn't know how to bring this up to her partner because her partner felt that it's disrespectful for you to talk about your relationship outside of the relationship to your friends. Is this something that you often see, or and if so, like how do we kind of help her partner open up to the idea that it is really important? I think about myself. I'm always open with my partner, with my husband, in terms of what I'll talk about to my best friend. You know, obviously it's not everything, but by talking to her about it, sometimes she'll be like, "You were wrong." You know, Cindy, you should have just like that was wrong. Or sometimes she'll say, "Well, I actually don't agree with him, but here's how you can approach it with him." Like it really helps us to talk about it. But if we have a partner that's not open to that, how can we address that?
So I think it's important to discuss what your needs are, because that's the
Hmm,
common one as well, where
got it.
somebody says, you know, I really like to confide in my mother, my friends, my sister.
Right. That can
So
be touchy though, right? Because then the
it,
family members could bring it back into your marriage or your relationship.
exactly. So then when next week when things are great, you're like, well, now I just said all of these things about how
Right.
my marriage wasn't so good. So I think it's important to be careful about who we
Yeah.
tell and what we tell. And you want to respect your partner's wishes. And there might be times where it's more important to get support from somebody else, whether it's a therapist or you
Right.
have a
Got
friend
it.
maybe that doesn't know your partner. If you have a friend from college that lives in another state and you think, well, you know, could this be my confidant, somebody that I can
Mm,
talk to? And then to talk about those bigger issues too, like sometimes families are struggling. Like if you're struggling with an infertility issue, who are you going to
right.
tell? And it's
Mm,
okay to say to your
mm,
partner, like, I understand you want to keep this private, but I need some support. So what can we do about that? Is there somebody that you would feel okay if I talk to about this? Or should I go to a support group? And having those sorts of conversations, I think, is really important. But then to just lay it out there, like, I get that you don't want me to air our dirty laundry. However, sometimes I need support about and to have conversations with my friends about what's normal and what isn't and how they deal with certain issues. How do you propose I do that? And just ask the question and see what your partner can come up with. They might be like, I just don't want you to tell that one gossipy friend, but if you were to tell this other friend over here, that wouldn't be so bad. Or, it's okay if you talk to one of your friends, but let's not talk to our immediate family because that will make Thanksgiving dinner awkward or whatever it is. So I think to have those sorts of conversations and to be really upfront, because what often happens is somebody's like, well, my partner doesn't want me to tell anybody, but I need to talk to somebody, so I'm going to do it anyway behind their back, and then no good will come of that.
Yeah, but thank you for that guidance. I think it's really helpful to hear that because it's not about avoiding it, right? Like you were saying at the beginning, but it's truly about having those conversations and letting your partner know what you're thinking and what matters to you and your needs are. So that's what I'm getting from all of this. And I think it's really important for us to hear that. Another one that was really important to me and stood out is when you build resentment sometimes and you feel like you're the partner suffering too much, or maybe your partner's the one saying like, I do everything, and it's really hard. And you end up in this situation when one's the martyr. I love that you brought that up in your book. Can we dig a little bit deeper in terms of like, what does that mean?
So this one, I wasn't sure how it would be received, but since the book has come out, this is the one that people said that they related to the most, which is kind of
so interesting
because
it stood out to me as well. Yeah.
And so people will say, like, yeah, I'm kind of that person. Like I stay up till 2 a.m. and I'm slamming stuff around and I'm like, cause I have to do it cause nobody else will. Or somebody will say, I work really hard and I just can't get any help from my family. So I don't let my partner help out anyway. And yet, and of course, things are never going to be 50-50. And you want to make sure like being in a relationship means you have to make lots of sacrifices, but it doesn't mean that you always have to be the one to make all the sacrifices or that you have to do everything. So when people become martyrs, they often refuse to ask for help. And when somebody offers help, they refuse to accept it. And they tend to grow bitter and resentful of like, I've done everything for you, but they weren't doing it.
But they're not accepting.
Right. And that they really are just convinced, like, if I let my partner help, they'll screw it all up. So I'm just going to do it on my own. And it's a tough cycle to break free from.
I've seen that with new parents as well. Like I've heard some moms who feel like they have a routine, with their child, with their newborn, and they don't want to let their partner in for certain routines. But then they're complaining and saying like, it's too heavy. Like I have too much on my hands. But then they don't want to, accept the help. So it becomes a very heavy burden for us. Where does that come from? Does it stem from anything, from our past? Is it just somebody who wants to make it seem like they have it all together, or are there different reasons for it?
I think there can be different reasons, and two of them that you just mentioned. Sometimes we grow up in a home where maybe you get the most attention for always helping out, or and I think girls especially for being polite and kind and the good one and doing chores and all of those sorts of things. And sometimes it's from a functional family. Sometimes it's dysfunctional too, though. Sometimes people grow up with a parent with a substance abuse issue, and you had to kind of grow up way too soon, and you always did everything anyway. So then it's tough to ask for help later on. And then I think sometimes it's because, we're embarrassed to ask for help, or we just don't want to show any sort of vulnerability. So we think if I just do everything. And finally, sometimes it is just frustrating, or like it's more energy for me to show you how to do this, so I might as well just do it myself. Or we think, if my partner doesn't know how to do something, it's going to take me a while to show you how to do it. And also it's maybe anxiety provoking for me to watch you do it your way. I like to do it this way. And when you do it that way, I'm like, so it's just easier for me to do it myself.
I get that. So how do you break out of this cycle if you're I think we're all aware, and I was like this too at the beginning, and I still am to a certain extent, where sometimes I just want to get it done, and I'll do it my way, and I've had these discussions with my partner. However, I've learned to step back a lot and say like, well, you do that really well, so you'll take that. Like he's in charge of the laundry. I don't have to do that part, and it helps. But I think for me, the way that I had worked on it was kind of stepping back a little bit. But what can somebody do that's listening to this? How do they start breaking that cycle?
So I think it's sometimes just recognizing like how often do you ask for help or say that you need help with something.
Right.
We often make complaints, but we don't ask for help. Like, oh, I have
It's
so
true.
much to do. Why don't you
Yeah.
just ask somebody to
So,
help or pitch in instead of, because we want something. Like when we say that out loud, like, oh, I have so much to do, or nobody helps me, or I have
mm,
to do everything around here. Like, what is it that I'm looking for? Do I want recognition? Am I looking for attention? Do I need some validation that I do a lot of
mm,
work? But if you just stop and say, I could really use some help. And it's not always like the moment by moment thing. If you are doing everything around the house, it's not just a, hey, could you do the dishes? Like you might need to have the conversation of, it would be great if on a regular basis you could notice what needs to be done around here and pitch in instead of me
mm,
having to tell you. Because I'll use women as an example. Women
yeah.
often get caught up in the cycle of almost parenting their husbands, where they're then like,
Right.
I'm going to tell you to do the dishes the same way I would tell the 14-year-old that it's time to do a chore. And
That's heavy.
instead of
Mm,
expecting somebody to step up and recognize, like, no, I'm smart enough to know what needs to be done around the house, and I can just spring into action and I don't need to be told. So that's
mm,
definitely a pattern that we sometimes get into. And you want to break that. Ask for help, but also have those bigger conversations sometimes. And then also just ask yourself, like, does this really need to be done? If I don't do this today, like, what's going to happen? And sometimes it's just about cutting ourselves some slack. Like, the
mm.
sun is still going to rise tomorrow. Or if I don't do this, is somebody else in the house going to step up and do it tomorrow morning? If there
Yeah.
aren't any clean forks, is somebody else going to then have to figure out, if I'm going to eat breakfast, how do I get a clean fork? Sometimes it's just
Yeah.
allowing for those natural consequences too. And then also notice when somebody does offer to help, what your response is. And if your natural
Mm,
reaction is to say no, and it might not even be help, it just might be that somebody's like, oh, hey, mom, you can have the biggest piece of cake. And you're like, oh, no, I don't do that. Just because sometimes we kind of
mm,
refuse the kindness that other people offer us too. So it might just be like, I'm going to let somebody be nice to me and I'm going to accept it. And we're doing them a favor when we accept it too, but it's okay to do those things, accept it, and let yourself
mm.
feel good.
That's hard for some people, I think. I've seen with older family members, mostly women, when you're like, this dinner was delicious, or thank you for, I can't think of something, or you look great, or, they see a picture of themselves and they often go towards like negative comments, like even in front of my kids, where it's like, no, no, the dinner is not what it should have been, or, oh, I look terrible in this picture. It's these negative, this negative dialogue that they have comes out, and it's really hard to break through that. Yeah, I'm assuming this plays a big role, big role in this as well.
It does, and there's sort of
Mm,
off the cuff comments where maybe somebody says, oh, the women's work is never done, and you kind of in
mm,
the family and kids will see like, oh, okay, how did the other generations do it, and this is the
right.
roles people play, and even though
Yeah.
they're subtle, they certainly do make an impact.
Yeah. The last piece of this conversation, I there's so much that I want to talk to you about, but like the one that my husband and I were having a heated debate over was, that we shouldn't stop growing and changing. And we interpreted that very differently. And I think it's because of our personalities. So I'm the kind of person who's reading a book every single day, something different, something about business, something about neuroscience. Obviously, I'm a neuroscientist, something about the brain, so anything, psychology. And I try to take that in, interpret it. I talk with my friend about it, and we think about like how we could apply that to our lives. Versus like my husband, and I'm sure we're not the only couple like this, where he's like, I'm good with the way things are. Like, what does that mean? So when I brought this up and I started reading that chapter to him, he was like, well, what if you're comfortable with who you are and there's nothing really major that you want to change? Does that mean I don't want to change? Is that a bad thing? And then, so we continue with that debate. But what were you seeing again when it came to that in terms of couples? Or were they growing apart because of different goals and values? Were they changing as as the years went on?
Oh, that's a interesting to hear the two perspectives. So I would
Right.
see a couple different things. Sometimes a couple would come in and like their partner was angry. So for
Hmm.
example, they would say, well, when I married this person, they had all these big hopes and dreams, and now 20
Hmm.
years later they just don't get off the couch. Like, I don't even know who this person is anymore.
Right. Yeah.
And what they weren't really honoring is like, well, life change. Maybe you met in college where your partner was
Hmm.
like full of all of these big ideas, and now you've got a career and kids and a mortgage. And
Right.
so of course, like joining the
Yeah.
Peace Corps and moving to a third world country may not be high on their priority list anymore, because life has changed and so has their role. At that core of who they are, though, they're still the same kind person that you met. So their values are probably still very much who they were
Hmm.
when you met, but on the other hand, their priorities and the way that they live life might have changed. And so I think all of us
Interesting.
do grow and change, whether we want to or not, life
Mm,
changes, but you just want to make sure that you're not growing apart as a couple. And a
mm,
lot of people think that it's like conflict that kills marriage. Like, oh, if we argue, then we'll end up in a divorce.
mm.
But the research is pretty clear. The number one reason why couples get divorced is more like boredom. And when
Wow.
people are always, we go to the
Yeah.
same restaurant once a month and that's
Yeah.
all we do for excitement, and nothing new ever happens, and
Yeah.
we don't expect anything different from each other. We don't do anything that's fun and
Mm,
exciting. That often leads to couples breaking up. So I think it's
mm,
important for us to know, like, I'm going to learn something new this week. I'm going to go do something different. And it doesn't have to be huge things. You don't have to say, hey, I'm going to evolve into this new being. But you might just say, like, oh, at this age, I'm going to try something new next week, or I'm going to hit a different gym. It could be just little things that we grow and change both on our own, because you want to keep them some mystery sparked and your partner gets to still get to know who you are even though you're
mhm.
growing and changing. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that you're growing and changing together too. As the world's changing, as a couple, you have to adapt to those changes, and as your lives evolve and
Hmm.
kids grow older, or
Right.
your career changes and your financial situation changes, life is going to be different.
Do you ever see one partner, at some point, I'm going to say around 40s, 40s and 50s,
Mm-hmm.
kind of want something? You spoke about that boredom, but I'm thinking now, I just turned 40 this year, and I think of the conversations between my friends and I where it's like, I've had enough. I want to start traveling and I want to start doing this and I want to do that and I want to stop working and open up my own company. Like lots of big dreams all of a sudden. And I'm assuming that's happening very often around that age where maybe you've been in this relationship now for 15 years, whatever it is. And now all of a sudden a partner and a relationship that you were comfortable with, where you were aligned in terms of where your life was going to go. And one partner just goes the other direction and says like, I want to do this all of a sudden. I'm assuming that would be really hard to kind of manage too in a relationship.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. There's something
Hmm.
about that magical age of 40 that suddenly
Is
people are
it? Yeah.
like, yeah, like
Yeah.
I had that dream that I was going to be my own business. And
Right.
now here I'm at 40, and it's kind of like where you think, if I don't do it now, I'm never going to do it.
Right.
So you might have one partner that's like, we can retire comfortably at 55. And the other person's like, actually, I'd like to quit my job and launch a business. And there's no
Yes.
guarantee that it's going to go well. So
Yeah.
then you think, all right, how do you manage that? And that kind of goes back
That's
to the
huge.
needs thing. One person
Mm.
might have a need for more risk and excitement. And the other person's like, actually, I need some security at this age because I have no desire to start over when it comes
No.
to our financial situation.
Yeah.
So it does need to be managed, where you think, oh, how do I make sure that we're both working on this? And again, it might be a series of conversations. Sometimes it's about putting a safety nets in place so that both people feel comfortable, or to talk about, like, let's say you want to start traveling a lot. I have no desire to travel. So how are we going to manage that? Could you travel
Mm.
with friends?
Mm.
Do we agree that, all right, we'll travel, but we'll go to more of the places I'm comfortable going? Sometimes it's a
Got it.
compromise. Sometimes it's more of a divide and conquer. Like, you want to go tour whatever country, like, have at it. I'm not interested. So how can we do that? So I think it just goes back to communication.
Mm. And addressing the needs all the time. It seems to be something that came up a lot, with in our conversation, like addressing our needs. And it's something that's interesting because I talk to parents about that. I tell them that, they might have needs they might have had certain needs before having kids, and now after kids, it doesn't mean that your needs disappear. I think sometimes it's easy for us to kind of put that to the side, and we have the needs of our, children first and our partners, and then we come last, and we forget that we have those needs as well. But it seems to be the same thing in a relationship, where addressing your needs and your partner's needs constantly, it's always evolving.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think you're right that once people become parents, then it's like your own needs seem to fall lower and lower on the priority list.
Right.
And we often
Yeah.
forget, like, oh, no, it's okay to do something for
Hmm.
myself, or to meet some of my own needs too.
And I think it's important for our kids to see that as well. Like my kids know I have a Kindle and I'm just always reading. And as soon as there's like 5 minutes here and there, it's small. It's always by my side, and I'll just read like 2 pages, and they know mommy's reading again. But they understand. The other day they were telling me, you and daddy aren't the same. You don't like the same things. Daddy likes board games. He likes these 3-4 hour board games that I can't handle. It's just not my thing. So he'll do that with them. But I'll be the one who'll say, like, let's go to the bookstore or let's go to the library and let's read some books together. And it's interesting because they're still very young. They're 4, 6, and 8, but they totally grasp the concept that we have different interests. And I think it's important for our kids to see that.
I think so too, for
Mm,
them to know that, yeah,
mm,
you can have different interests. And as human beings, we all have slightly different interests, and that you
right.
can foster those in many different ways. If somebody has
Mm,
a love of books, like you said, you might just be reading on your Kindle regularly, or you spend time in bookstores. Or
mm,
somebody else who loves books, maybe they write books, maybe they are only reading one kind of book, or
right.
they're interested in it. So, yeah, all of those things, I think, for
Mm.
kids to then know it's okay to explore different things.
So what if a couple is listening to this and saying, okay, Amy mentioned that boredom piece, and it's clear in our relationship we've been together for X amount of years, and we're stuck in that rut of just being in the regular everyday routine, and every day is, we don't even know if it's a Monday or Saturday. It's the same kind of day. What can a couple do to start working on that? You know, is it little things, or is it like big? You know, sometimes I think like with social media as well, like you see these people go on like big trips, and maybe somebody's like, well, I can't do that, I'm not ready for that yet. Is there a way to tackle that boredom piece in small baby steps?
There are. I think there's a couple things you could do. So one is to schedule something fun together and put it on the
Hmm.
calendar, because just having something to look forward to makes a big difference. And it might
It's
just be
true.
we're gonna try this new place to visit, or this new part to explore, this new part of town, go on a hike in a certain part of the woods that we've
Hmm.
never seen before. It doesn't have to be anything huge. Maybe we're going to watch a movie together, but put it on the calendar for Friday at
Hmm.
7 p.m. or whenever you're actually going to do it, because that does a couple things for us. It gives us something to look forward to, but it also increases the likelihood that we'll actually do it. How often do we like,
Right.
oh yeah, we always wanted to go to that place
Yeah.
in town, and you drive by it a million times, but you've never actually made the time to go.
It's
So when
true.
you put it on the
Yeah.
calendar, it increases the chances that you'll actually do it.
Yeah.
But we also know when you do something fun with somebody, you actually like the person a lot better. And so it
Yes.
doesn't matter whether you're talking about your neighbor, your cousin, whoever you go do
Yeah.
something fun with, like your brain gets happy. You would know this
Hmm.
better than I do, but then you
But it's
also
true.
then
Yeah.
the happiness like spills over, and you're like, "Hey, I like this person."
Hmm.
And so and it's, you might take turns with like, let's pick something fun. So if you have a partner who loves board games and you love reading, you might be like, all right, well, you don't love this and I don't love that, but let's find a couple things we do like. Let's sign up for a Chinese cooking class. Let's go
Mm.
explore somewhere. And it doesn't have to be huge, like once a year trips or anything like that, but you might just say, twice a month, let's just pick like random
Something.
things to
Right.
try and go do it. And it might
Mm.
be that, we sign up for a karate class and it's ridiculous and we never go back again. That's okay. You
I'm
tried
sure you
something
laughed.
new.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I think anything like that, and it could just be exploring new places, or calling people you haven't spent time with in a really long time, or visiting somebody or somewhere new, just to get a better idea, like what are you interested in and what you
Mm.
like about that. And it could spark new conversations too.
What happens if you're in a relationship where maybe your partner is not receptive to that? Maybe they're comfortable in the boredom or like the regular every single day thing. How do you, like, does it come back to what you were saying before in terms of saying like, I need us to do something a little different, I need a bit of that excitement?
Yeah, I think so. You explain what your needs are and say it's an experiment. Hey, if we go do this thing and it's awful and we both hate it, like we don't have to keep doing it, or
Mm.
we don't have to do it all the time, but I would love to do this thing with you. And maybe you give them a menu of options too. You give somebody like, I thought of like 10 things we could do. What on this list sounds like something you'd be willing to try?
Right.
And see what they say. And if you have somebody that doesn't want to go out and do something too, I guess I would look into it. Like, are they an extreme introvert? Do they have social anxiety, and going out of the house
Mm-hmm.
also makes them too anxious? Might they be struggling with depression at the moment?
Mm.
And even if it's all of those things, can you watch a movie at home? Is there something that you
Right.
could do at home still that would be fulfilling, and at least give you a little something different once in a while?
Right. And my husband and I, we don't go out very often. We're more the like take in, like order in kind of thing. But I actually like going out. So I want to share this because maybe this is also a piece of advice that somebody could relate to. Sometimes when I'm out with my friend, I'll send him the menu and I'll say like, what, if we were together, what would you choose? Like, which drink would you choose? Or choose my drink. I'm not going to like surprise me, and he'll send me the name of the drink and say, try this one. Let me know how it is. I respect that it's not his thing to go out, and we've been together now for a really long time. So it's a matter of like, I'll like stay in because I know it's important to him, but I'll go out with my friends, but try to incorporate him in that. And it feels good, like it just, it works for us. I don't know if it's right, but it
And
works for us.
I think that's a great way to do it. And, if you have a partner who doesn't like to go out, maybe you still try a different restaurant. You order in once in a while, or you cook
Right.
at
At
home,
least.
but you cook something different. Maybe the two of you
Yes.
just look up something
Yeah.
and be like, we've never tried this before. Should we try
Yeah.
this? And you cook together at home.
Yeah.
Or you have a picnic and you just eat in a different place than you normally
Right.
do.
Yes.
Lots of things you could do, even
Yeah.
if somebody doesn't necessarily want to leave the house or you have a financial constraint too.
Right, exactly. So, I love looking behind you because every time we talk, there are more and more books. You're adding to the collection. I absolutely love it. I wonder if there's a next one coming out. I don't know, but you've covered so much, with regarding us and our own mental strength, our children, us as parents, and now in relationships. Congratulations on everything that you're putting out. I have the workbook that I keep looking at, and I'm still working through. I keep adding little post-its to it, and I use them for journaling. I don't write in the book. It really bothers me to write in these nice books. That's just me. So I have my own notebook, and I like to use that to think through, again, going back to that growth and change. For me, it's really important to always reflect on who I am and how I can improve it. And you've been a really big part of that. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much for all that. I'm thrilled that you like it.
It's amazing. So I guess as we close this conversation, if somebody's listening to this and saying, okay, they covered a lot today. Now, what are the first steps to all of this? If I feel that my relationship is really struggling, where do I begin? Because we've mentioned so many things, and maybe they're checking the boxes off everything that we mentioned. How do they begin the work tomorrow?
So, I think a really simple place to start is just notice good things about your partner. I talk about this in the book too, that we tend to get so used to just overlooking the good things that they do. We focus more on the fact that they forgot to bring home a jug of milk, or they didn't answer a text message, and we forget wow, they still did some amazing things. So I think sometimes just take a step back, notice what you appreciate about your partner, and hold some of those conversations on purpose. Like, I really appreciate that you work really hard. I really appreciate the things that you do. I think that could be one of the most powerful places to start, especially if you're caught up in a negative cycle. Start breaking that cycle just by noticing the positive things and pointing them out, and step back and see what happens.
That's really good advice. We don't want to take the book and just throw it in front of them and say, like, we're not doing well. And we're going to identify everything that we're doing wrong with this book. It's a good place to start. Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate this conversation, and I look forward to the next book so that we can talk again.
Thank you so much for having me.